So what I would like to do today is kind of go and look into some of the uh, or continue looking into sound examples that mostly show on our listening room, and specifically, I kind of relate this to the whole idea of listening to noise and so on. So if we go and look at the Model 6 listening room, I started reviewing this on Tuesday, so I kind of related a little bit to other pieces that are more of a mainstream popular music genre, and the deal with glitch, with use of noise, the idea that you lend yourself to the opportunities of the machine to kind of create variations, create ideas, and generate music. And Brian Eno, which is, it's a wonderful film. It's a long one, so we don't really include this as, I mentioned this in my lecture notes, but we don't really, I'm not going to have like an elaborate discussion about this piece. But I highly recommend kind of checking them out. I think these are very communicative representations of the use of technology and the use of uh, music and sounds and noise that technology allows. So what I kind of started mentioning before I started the recording was the idea that one of the issues that contemporary music has, and the ideas that we will explore in this Stockhausen space, is how to approach or how we can understand and compose music when, because of the flexibility, because of the idea that the computer becomes a very dominant instrument, in a sense that it's not clear what it is. It's already, it's a production tool. It's an instrument. We don't limit ourselves to musical instruments that produce specific tones. Um, and when we were going through the logic of the class, presenting music in this very broad way of organizing sounds and trying to contrast noise with sound, we went through the process of trying to explain that tones, which are the more traditional, the more established ways of creating, our basic sound elements that we can organize. Tones lend themselves to quite a bit of organization. We spoke about consonants, we spoke about dissonance, and the idea of intervals, which sound more pleasant, less pleasant. We kind of suggested that this led to development of a lot of the Western music theory. So polyphony, harmony, all became at a certain point subjects of almost like mathematical or logical research. And I mentioned, that Ali's phase of representation, that at least he gives a lot of significance, because once you think about music as something that you can abstract, you can think about relations between elements, and you can start categorizing, and building chords, building progressions of chords, the concept of tonality, right? And again, we are not going into music theory as such, because this is more of a class showing that kind of idea of sound and organizing sound in this very broad aspect. But there is this formidable body of knowledge, I would say, and artistic making that came from development of musical theory that is done in some sense on paper in symbolic ways, right? Now, once we start dealing with sounds that we don't know how to represent, we don't know how to categorize, we have to go and find new ways of organizing them. And this is what a little bit this piece, the Stockhausen's Kontakte, represents. It moves a little bit from, um, well, I would say we had an example before, the Risa example that we considered last week, which was sort of like one step further from sound walks, right, or soundscapes, by creating an interesting kind of a storyline of going, and so I'm kind of referring again and reminding the previous week's lecture also, and Jean-Claude Rousseau's suit, which I think once we have done the soundscape assignment, the soundwalk and the soundscape, we I think we can kind of relate to this, right? You listen to the sound. It's sort of the ecology and storytelling in sound, but it is still grounded in space. What space and time? There is a trajectory. The interesting aspect here is that Jean-Claude Lissette started blending this with electronic sounds, musical sounds, and we could think about the ambiguity and these transformations. But I think the storyline, even if it becomes a little abstract and becomes um, just musical textures that go back and forth, he goes back to the shore, he goes back to the sounds, and you can see this as maybe storytelling that you know goes a little bit more bizarre into the musical realm, musical domain, and goes back to the more of a concrete recognition of place and time. Now, in the case of Stockhausen, um, the piece is much more abstract. It really deals with relations and these contacts, right? The encounters between electronic sound and instrumental sound. So many people, and Stockhausen himself, and he tried to explain this piece, and that other people try to analyze, have to refer to novel ways or approaches to understand such music. Okay, so in my slides, when I refer to this piece, kind of like when go through the idea of Western music and noise and technology, and the idea of how we can listen to noise, I'll kind of a little bit skip. Well, I'll just kind of browse through the slides. Um, we have this timeline that more and more of the technological developments allow us to break away from organizing sound in traditional ways. So here is this piece Kontakte, and I'll talk about the mixed instrumental and tape version. Um, now, one of the problems or one of the approaches to understand this musical piece is by using the terms of narrativity. So, what is narrativity? What is storytelling? And we'll listen a little bit to the music in a second, but I kind of just want to frame this as a possible approach to listening to this piece. Um, so the idea is that a series of forms of contact brings together electronic music and instrumental music. That's kind of in the name. The electronic sound categories establish relationships and transitions between the instrumental timbres, fusing with them and departing from them towards hitherto unknown regions of sound. So, so where is the story, right? The story is in relations between electronic and musical instruments, and the story is in some way just composing these various little kind of microforms that establish these relations. Now, this is very different from the narrativity in, let's say, in Jean-Claude Risset's music, right? Because there we had a story. I mean, so let's maybe a little bit before we move to listen to the piece, just mention what is narrativity. Okay, what is so maybe one more. step of defining the terms, because I think it helps us to then listen in that context. Okay. Um, so, narrativity is, or the theory itself, is about basically creating a storyline, right? And narrativity and story, they're kind of synonyms in some sense. I mean, story in literature, right, in film, is maybe so story has a narrative, or it might have a narrative. Um, so stories may be a specific rendering of a narrative. So I will not go into the slight differences. We can think about this as a story. And in story, you have time, you have something developing, you have understanding of some kind of agenda, some kind of dynamics that's happening, and you have events. So uh, if we want to apply narrativity to musicology, or use this in musicology as a way to analyze music, we need to think about events and agendas or stories. And when we spoke about the idea of representation, and the whole ability to notate music before, when we talk about very abstract representations, there is this theory of semiotics. So there's signs, there's signifiers. Something means something else. Okay, you have a message that represents a code. So these are a lot of cultural theory concepts here, but I wanted to introduce them because I think this is what we're going to look into this piece. Okay, can we have some kind of groups of sounds that relate to events and that signify something that could be something very abstract, and the idea is that you create these small segments, small forms. Okay, and I'll talk a little bit about the seal techniques and poiesis as a narrative concept, narrative after we listen. So let's go quickly, and um, uh, this video was not available anymore, so I put a link uh, to another recording, and um, it's a long piece, so we'll just listen to some excerpts. Let's start with the beginning, just going to get the setting, get the opening, and the feel. It's all about relations of electronic sounds and instrumental sounds. Okay, so can just to give us a little bit of a taste of the sound world where this piece exists. Looking into the score, I think is interesting. Just a second, let me find that the score itself. So this is how this piece is notated. And you can see that it's actually quite a challenging task even to represent the music. So we're talking about basically several musical instruments, um, well, and percussion, including piano. Piano is sometimes considered a percussive instrument. So you know, a lot of rhythm, a lot of changes in timbre, musical gestures, which are kind of explained in different ways of controlling the different expressions of these instruments. So he actually elaborates a lot, and he creates his own notation for different types of sounds that could be performed or you know extracted from these sounds. And then he created his own. Just a second, yeah. Okay, yep. Um, uh, little phrases, little ways of explaining how you know different musical notes um, should be basically played both in terms of switching from piano to percussion, dynamics. Now he thinks in categories of sounds. He would say, well, does it matter now? So this is the score. Okay, this is the beginning. Okay, it sounds. It starts with this bowing on the cymbal or the gong, and very precisely timed because this part is the tape. Okay, now this tape is really kind of described in very kind of symbolic way as something that Stockhausen felt that represents the type of sound texture. So here you have a lot of things going on. Whatever, I don't know how you could paint this, or you could maybe gesture this in some way. Here you have some smaller points, right? You have these little sound blips that happen, okay? And below we have the percussion instruments and the pianist. And they create these musical gestures. Now, of course, on a piano, you notate the notes. Now, I might make some performers very upset, but if you ask me, do I think the specific notes matter here, or the composers? Frankly, these are overall gestures. And nobody will notice if you played a false note here. You would notice if you kind of get totally out of the scope of this gesture, and you don't have this idea of jumping up and down. And here maybe you have a cluster, you have a chord, and then you do perceive the overall structure. You definitely can see how things spread out, and then they go to these slower notes and so on, and you have these notes being played on a percussion instrument that has these pitches more or less, uh, and of course these kind of gestures in dynamics from fortissimo to pianissimo, from very loud to very soft, with this tremolo, trembling kind of vibrations going on. So um, we think now in terms of aggregates, and this whole thing becomes kind of a signifier for some energy, some performance event. Okay, uh, let's kind of I'll play again. This is the first, what is it, 39 seconds, 46 seconds. I'll click the play button on the video again, and maybe we'll try kind of to follow this one. I think it kind of helps a lot to guide our listening to what's going on. And you can see that a lot of this is really trying to create these points of contact between tape music and the instrumental music. So let's do it again. A sec. Yep. Am I playing? Should be playing, but oh, so sorry. I put the volume to 0. So this. It starts and this keeps vibrating, and the tape will also come in. This, okay? You're here. Okay, and that's where we are. Okay, we're at 1 minute, a little bit after this, 46 seconds, 49. We have this strange going, this note, and then we continue this piece. And you have this interesting kind of like gestures, symbolic ways to represent. Now, how can we otherwise explain what's going on in the tape music? For instrumental music, yes, we have to write these performance gestures. This is something that he created um, in his studio with the synthesizers that he used. And in some sense, these juxtapositions have to be judged using novel terms. You know, we cannot really talk here about harmony and melody. Even the rhythm is more of a categories of density of movement, right? So, kind of browsing through all of these elements and points kind of gives an idea of what um, um, what he was trying to establish here. Basically, these little events, and he has numbers on top of the score, which indicate basically sections, and each one is subdivided. Now, how do you compose this? Basically, is this sort of a random way of creating these sounds? No, I mean, it's super structured. He had his own system. The idea is that the system was somewhat of a formal way of organizing it. Besides the inspiration of thinking about textures and different categories of these larger musical elements, for him, these were kind of symbols that he could manipulate and manipulate the relations between them. Now, when we talk about this idea that bringing away from the traditional music, making that happened towards the beginning of the 20th century, we spoke about the futurism that brought a lot of non-musical sounds, but we also spoke about, at least we mentioned the idea of serial music, right? Serialism, and you know what happened with this type of music was that Arnold Schoenberg, who kind of created the 12 tone idea that you don't need to have tonality anymore. And again, I'm mentioning terms that we did not really explore in depth because of the music, not the limitations and also the scope that I want to kind of show the bigger pictures. But if the traditional music evolved towards tonality in harmony, uh, uh, breaking this into something that doesn't have any sense of the classical traditional music was by introducing a formal method of saying let's use sequence of notes, and also please try to do the sequence of notes in such a way that doesn't imply that you have chords, you have melodies, just sort of like organization, abstract organization sounds, and then you manipulate this mathematically. You go back and forth, you can switch it, you can flip it. So in this piece, Stockhausen also uses the concept of this serial organization in the sense that he thinks about categories of sounds now, and he creates sequences of these categories, and then he keeps manipulating them in different ways, relations, including spatial relations. I mean, we didn't explore this here because we don't really have a nice spatial sense in this recording, but also dynamics. I mean, some people even call this total serialism. Any parameter of musical expression was put on some kind of a sequence, okay, and then these sequences were mathematically reorganized. Um, well, I mean, it could be pretty annoying, right? To think about music that this is what it is, just a bunch of mathematical operations. But you know, I think we do want to at least kind of keep in mind that this is a possibility. Of course, this very formal mathematical representation might go a little bit against something of, trying to create a specific, more traditional musical form, and maybe some emotional relations that we have to traditional music, melodies, harmonies, they do exist, right? So, um, so this is, we have to live with this kind of idea that you mechanize mechanical composition in some sense, or formalize it to a level that it will be mechanized, and we still want to use this. So I think today with computers and abilities to represent music in some very mathematical ways, but neural networks, whatever. The question of representation, understanding what's in that music, still exists, but we are able kind of to create these kind of blended situations where complex music is still represented, and also the traditional music, or the complexity of the traditional music and novel music are kind of both coexist um, um, in formal ways. But here is really him trying to express or find ways to compose with these concepts. Now, yeah, so explain a little bit more about the score. Uh, yes, so as the question on the chat was, yes, these are the seconds. You actually have to keep very strict timing because the tape is not flexible. In normal musical performance, musicians kind of synchronize themselves. That's a lot of the expressivity comes from little deviations. Here, because you have one rigid soundtrack that goes on, this has to be exactly notated. But I mean, the musicians follow this pretty much by the ear. They know these events when they happen, but you might still have a clock with seconds. So these are times, and these are the three parts. The F's and the P's are the dynamics, and a lot of little kind of textual explanations. Um, let's jump, maybe go back to the score, and or go back to the recording, and I'll find an element in the score that maybe shows uh, more of convergence or contact between the abstract sounds and the musical sounds around a specific pitch, right? Because before we had all these textures going on. So somewhere around, where would that be? Let me, not this one. Okay, the chat is that way. Yeah, okay, somewhere. Okay, this one. Sorry, yeah, I'm trying to find a good. Yeah, okay. All right, this is relatively um, 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 I would say easy, but in evident um, section where we have something, we have here these individual notes and little kind of um, note kind of continuations or glisses happening in the tape. Okay, you can kind of try to imagine what it would be like. Okay, so kind of like even in terms of kind of gestures. And uh, um, the piano, basically playing these long notes, okay, these two note, I mean, piano and here you have the percussion instruments. Then something happens, right? There is this big thing going in the piano from very loud to very soft, okay, all over the register. You have these waves of playing on cymbals that go like from waves of basically cymbals going in and out. Then it goes into very slow one. You have this tape piece going with layers that increase, increase, increase. Then they disappear, and there's this one band of noise that now becomes like the melody, but it's not really a melody. You have this, okay, that's what it would be. It would be kind of a pitch contour going down, or I don't know, just sitting there.
Sorry to interrupt.
Yes, please.
So for the bottom left, I thought that's two percussion instruments, but you said it was piano.
So this is the piano. Sorry, this is the two percussion. Right, right. The pianist moves. This is piano, and this is two percussion, and this is percussion. You're correct. Yes.
Okay, so the piano doesn't play for that like bar, I guess.
Yeah, the piano. It's the same musician moving from this to this one. Okay, and here's the clavier, and here's playing on the piano.
And also, isn't so for the like the picture thing, like a square and two circle. So like, is it like same instrument playing? Why does it like same instrument right in different like place? I'm just like.
Oh, because these are two performers. Okay, let me go back to the score. Okay.
Oh, so like the pianist actually stand up and play the instrument as well.
I think the way it's organized is that he is able to move between the piano and this one, and that's the second performer.
Cool.
Okay, and the notation itself, has to be, if you go all the way up in the beginning of the score, he actually explains all of these notations. This is pretty common in modern music, that you come up with your own like little symbols that describe what what specific types of also you specify, of course, a lot about what melodies you use, if they're soft or hard, and so on. But you also try kind of to explain some notations which maybe seem like common notations, but they're very different every time. So you have to kind of read and figure out what every instruction is. He symbolizes the instruments, so he gives this symbolic representations of traditional instruments. So these are basically just notations of the instruments that are being played. But because also there is no, the percussion set is not standard anymore, even that becomes kind of complicated. So he has kind of to put these squares and say that he's going to perform this on these bongos, okay, and here it will be the tom tom and this gong, okay. So these are the signs for the instruments that he's playing, and except for the piano where he writes clavier, that'll be the piano. Okay. So yeah, I mean, here are all the symbols of the different instruments that he wants the second performer to play. This is the tape, and this is the piano when he says the piano. But then the pianist also moves to perform on some of the percussion instruments. Yeah. So thanks for the question. Yeah. So I think we were around 17 minutes when we had this late list. Yeah, this here. Okay. So this is 17 minutes and 5 seconds. So let's start somewhere before. What will be like the page before starts at 16. We'll start somewhere here at 16 minutes, and we'll try to follow along. Okay. Okay, approximately somewhere here. So he's finishing this one. Here we are. So switch to the next one. Come on. So this is the and, and it has a pitch. So suddenly he thinks about tonality, or not tonality, tones, let's say. There's no tonality overall. They're like tones, pitches. And they meet on the same tone, okay? So you can feel that this reached the same frequency as this. Absolutely. Yeah, that's it. Yeah. All right. So, well, and this whole idea of also changing the relations between the musical materials, and here they converge on something which we made more traditional as a note, and now they disperse into some kind of a noisy texture, clusters of tones. And this is really one of the more dramatic kind of middle points of the piece. All right. So I hope kind of like by demonstrating a few of these points and showing also the idea of representation of these things, kind of brings us back to the question of, um, you know, how do we understand the storytelling here? Um, and is there a storytelling? So really one of the ideas that the composer points to, and some of the analysis or other researchers who kind of musicologists who try kind of to understand and generalize this concept, because one of the um, interesting processes that I think are going in modern music is that a lot of the experimental pieces, ones that draw people's attention and that become these milestones, cultural kind of accomplishments, um, a lot of people try kind of to make sense out of them and also see if there is a method. I mean, how would you teach? How would you create this into a new system of music making? So um, the similar process goes in terms of media theory and culture. So the ideas of narrative and idea of poiesis, I think, came as one way to understand what he's trying to accomplished here. So they're kind of contrasting concepts here. Narrative, as we said before, is really storytelling. But if you don't have an exact story, and the sound become more and more abstract, then the question uh, is there a narrative, right? So I'm bringing again, bringing back the idea of soundscape here. In soundscape, you had a story which was outside of the music, right? It was the story of going from place to place, maybe using, uh, normal life, daily objects to create sounds, and you would kind of just have this sound documentation, uh, and slightly detached perspective on your world, but you still had the story of something that happens. Maybe the agency wasn't there in such a strong way that you know that you have hero and anti-hero, or antagonist, protagonist. I mean, there's not really drama going on, but in the notion of understanding where you are and where things happen, you have this parallel um, storyline going on, and that's how we composed. That's how we composed the soundscape, right? You did the soundwalk before, and soundwalk had a meaning, right? You go in a um, space and time. Now we argue that we should listen to sounds in a reduced way, right? The reduced listening, we introduced this concept. Reduced listening is almost going against the idea of the narrative, right? Now I told you, once you put these musical or sound elements on a timeline, listen to them as if they're just pure sound and not as physical objects that produce the sound. So you almost have kind of to deliberately detach yourself from the story to listen to this as sound. Here we even don't have a story as such, right? It's pure music. Okay, very abstract music, but still pure music. Uh, and just as a reference, just as a point of reference, when we were talking about trying still to categorize and listen to the objects in some way, this is kind of the first video, the solfège d'object sonore, or the ear training of the sound object, right? This is really kind of where the people who did tape music and tape collages started thinking about categories of sound, textures of sound. So from this, we actually end up being in the Kontakte world, right, where we think about very abstract musical notations, musical gestures, and relations between these through kind of combined instrumental and very abstract tape sound. So how do we analyze all of that? Okay, um, first of all, uh, the concept of musical narrative, um, I mean, it was always existing. You could have music which had clear narrative. We can find classical music that even in very kind of traditional musical terms of melody, harmony, leitmotifs, and so on, make tells a story. Um, uh, Here we kind of think about narrative in a very abstract way. It's just communicating meaning by means of creating a temporal process. So the meaning becomes relations between sounds, surprises, changes in textures, this contact, basically this encounter and sort of a discourse between these sounds. That's the story, okay? And then how do we analyze this? Well, we can think about these musical units, how they switch, and part of the concepts that narrative brings in, and this is basically an assumption. What is needed to say that there is a story is that there is some sense of the wholeness, that you can follow some changes or transformations, and everything is kind of balanced in a sense that there is a completeness to this story. And these theories are actually, at least for the classical music, and definitions were developed by one of our colleagues, Jean Passler, musicologist who actually investigates mostly classical music. So we have the narrative, that well-informed storytelling by following the players, basically, and the players become these sound events as they change over time. Okay? Of course, in film and storytelling, narrative has way more clear structure, right? You can have, protagonist and antagonist, protagonist, and there is some kind of a inciting moment, something happens, then you move to, you know, second part of the story. There's usually this three-part structure of a narrative, and then things develop. There's this always lost this moment before the end, and then there is this big climax when things are resolved. We're kind of very much used to specific types of stories. In music, you also have quite a bit of musical structures, and again in Sud, there was much more clearer structure into larger blocks, going from you know uh, the shore and the forest sounds into more musical sounds and coming back. And there were also kind of transitions which became a little bit more abstract, but not as abstract as here. So the other opposite is poiesis. Now, what's poiesis? Poiesis is really something that comes out of nothing. Okay, poiesis is this blooming of the blossom. Okay? It's the act of making, the coming out of butterfly from a cocoon. I kind of used very kind of poetic definitions, but the idea here is that there is an idea that emerges, and sorry, there's an idea from which something physical is emergence. It's the act of creation. This is much more of a performative act. So by seeing these ideas emerge, uh, some people kind of think about storytelling as this emergence of little novel musical existences. Very abstract way to think about this, but I think it does help. Just a second now, I think I skipped too much. But kind of helps us to think about um, the whole idea of composing, right? Um, so when I said, does it have to be so radical? Well, maybe Kontakte is the most difficult conceptually, sound-wise, and also analytically piece to perceive. But in this case, it's one of my all the way back teachers of composition, especially when we were studying more contemporary music. That even with having years of classical training, they were always kind of shocking. And he said, well, if you don't like this piece, just listen to it enough until you love it. And there is this distinctive quality of some pieces that are really so well crafted and so well made that even if it comes from a totally different perspective, you, by listening several times, you almost kind of entrain yourself suddenly to understand what's going on. So in that sense, when you go to ambient music and glitch, uh, there the relations between these kind of sound events, this dialogue, okay, or this discourse between what the technology brings in and traditional music is much more controlled. It's much more, in some sense, I wouldn't say mellow, but the relations between more conventional ways of expressing yourself in musical terms and where the technology comes in, um, uh, they I would say exist much closer together, and then they also don't have this sort of a discourse, this kind of a radical way of thinking about music as a lot of emerging small elements, and then they kind of change the relations, and these relations are actually the story. Uh, oh, I cannot open this score on canvas. Let me see. Uh, Mm, I don't. It does work for me. Um,
When I try to open it, it says
so let me
unauthorized.
know. Yeah,
Yeah,
really,
but I figured there's
because
another
if you
link at the top.
so does it work for you now, or I have to find out a minute.
Oh, yeah. So when I try to click into this one, it doesn't work. But if I scroll to the top, there's like PDF version, so it works. So, yeah,
Okay,
there.
okay, but by clicking here it doesn't. Okay, I'll have to check what it is. And yeah, I mean the pianissimo or the triple piano is really very soft. Now, whether the narrative uh, can the narrative vary for different people? Well, definitely. I mean, the narrative itself is kind of the act of narration, it's the act of storytelling. And by invoking storytelling, you have to take into account the listener. Okay, even in this one, it's very evident that the listener makes sense of this music only if he has some sort of a prep. If he's going to try to follow certain things that happen in this piece, because otherwise it makes no sense. So this is an excellent question. I mean, because a lot of what we think about making music, in some sense, or maybe we adore music so much that we think that this is this isolated piece of art that has its own existence. So it's like a polished diamond, and here's it's out there, it has its value. The other perspective is really music. It's always relative to something else. It's like a message, it's like a story, so it has to communicate with somebody else. And also it asks questions about the meaning of listening, or any kind of question of understanding something, right? In the arts. But if we don't have this clear symbolism, we don't understand the signs, we have to translate this to basically a person trying to make sense out of that music. And so, and I'll get to poiesis in a second. Uh, but just making sense out of human experience, okay, assumes that the listener actually is always active. The listener predicts things. The listener is trying to anticipate the next event. This is why he's surprised. This is why he's sometimes excited. That's why sometimes it makes him nervous. And maybe sometimes he feels it calm because everything is kind of going as planned. So, in a very abstract way, it still assumes that the listener is active. He's doing his job of trying to make sense of music. Now, in stories, or anything, when you try to make sense of the story, you bring all of your previous experience, previous knowledge into play. The story doesn't teach you everything. You exist in a world where you have culture, you have previous experiences, other stories, sometimes references, and of course the evolution of the story itself. So, I don't have a good example of literature that makes perfect sense in one culture and doesn't make sense in a different culture. But I guess even in reading stories, and especially in poems, uh, the world of imagination, the world of the adjectives and the whole description, sometimes can be very emotional to one person. It can mean very little to somebody else. So for different people, the story means different things because they bring a different set of expectations and knowledge into play. And in that case, if we think about narrative as this idea of things that develop over time, and these three criteria that Jean Passler suggested, and I'm kind of using. So there is this article about narrativity in Kontakte that refers to a lot of the examples that I was showing. But if we think about what was the slide? Um, that it is a temporal process. There's something that's happening. So that's kind of the storytelling means there's something happening in time, but it has to have some set of conditions when this process can become a narrative. And again, these terms are very, very kind of abstract. What it means, self-regulation, and it means that it kind of comes to some point where things are balanced, they coexist. Okay, you feel that there was kind of a coherence or a wholeness, and that also things are related by transformation, which means you can understand how one thing is derived from another one. Frankly, I mean, my way of understanding these three terms is really that a person can decipher that something is going on. He has the sense of understanding in a very abstract way. He understands what happens. So if there are rules of why things follow, he can start analyzing them and making sense, and eventually that things kind of coexist or regulate themselves. That something comes in, then something else goes out in a very, very general way. But this is kind of the idea of narrative as structuring something in time through some manipulations and conditions of these manipulations. Poiesis is just the emergence of something. It's like, why would something happen? Okay, it's idea that becomes so that form or idea that precedes the physical, in the sense that a very abstract concept that then is realized in sound. It's kind of activity that creates an outcome. Usually more thought about as a performance versus narrative as a storytelling. So there is this kind of a separation between these two aspects. If you think about somebody standing on stage and telling a story, so narrative could basically be diegetic, it will be mimetic. I mean, these are kind of concepts that we don't really cover here, but you can tell a story by imitating something. You can tell the story by basically telling a sequence of events. Another one is a performance. You basically go on stage and you perform things. Something happens because of some ideas that you had, and in some sense, poiesis is like the intent. Is the intent or the motivation that comes before something happens. Why would you have this? I mean, it is kind of a little bit abstract concept to be able to explain as a concrete example, but I would say uh, it's more of a principle. Okay, if narrative is the way you already created that um, that story. Narrative is about the way the final um, product is done. Poiesis is this internal motivation, internal intent. Um, so, in the process of composing, that initial idea and some kind of an underlying principle that drives you to create something, that's the first emergence, is the poiesis. And then that motivation, that intrinsic motivation that drives you through the whole process, is the poiesis. The narrative is somehow what the story is about. Okay, so this play, or at least in this case, the emergence of something from nothing, it's because the music is so abstract. Okay, if you think only about the ideas that these are very abstract sounds, that they meet each other between instruments. Actually, once we have the instrument and we have the tape, the story becomes much more evident. The reason I chose this one and not the fully electronic version, the fully electronic version maybe has same elements, but you don't see these collisions. I mean, it all exists in that electronic world. Here, I mean, the discourse, I mean, there is the story being created just by the fact that you can now identify maybe not the original sound objects like in soundscape or sound work, but you still have these players. You have a little bit of that identity of musicians or types of instruments that kind of work against or with the tape. Um, I hope kind of, uh, uh, I'm not trying here to make perfect sense. It's almost impossible to make perfect sense. A lot of this is references to theories and ideas of language, the postmodern kind of type of explaining culture. But the fact is that there's so much happening and so little we can do to really now explain it in very established categories that we now think about much larger concepts, and things emerge kind of. There is a motivation for things to emerge and that they develop over time. But overall, I think going and scaling down and doing something useful. Let me kind of summarize this, okay? If I took you to very abstract realms here, I mean, this is a technique, right? You can think about writing music and having sketches of your music, and it doesn't matter. You can record sounds. You can record environmental sounds. You can process them. You can synthesize sounds in very abstract ways. You can and this could be also traditional music. I mean, it doesn't always have to be such abstract musical gestures, but you start thinking about this way of organizing your sounds, thinking about how they relate to each other, and that exists on a very abstract way anywhere. You can think about transitions in time, okay, relations between elements, a little bit like in abstract painting, like Kandinsky. You think about lines, you think about colors, you think about kind of tensions that they create in very very kind of generic ways of thinking. Well, what is spiritual in the arts? Kandinsky has this formidable piece, about spiritual in the art when he tries to explain abstract painting. In some sense, this is a little bit of the same idea of thinking. You have these gestures, you have the relations between things, and another thing is like, and this is a little bit of a preview for next week. We'll be doing sound painting. Now, what's sound painting? Sound painting is really some way of trying to come up with a vocabulary for very broad categories of sound. So poiesis, in that sense, and that will be maybe my best answer to question of poiesis, will be these emergent sounds that happen from gestures, from somebody kind of giving you an indication of something that he wants to express. And the basic elements will be in the gestures that we will kind of explain. But then they will basically emerge, and then moving from one gesture to another one, you'll try to create a story. Okay, so thinking about now next week, we'll kind of think about all of these. Okay, maybe less. I mean, this could be also translated into gestures, right? But here it's evident these are abstract things. Okay, so you could think about some way of notating that in graphics, but you can also think about giving some kind of a gestural things, long notes, short notes. You can have some kind of expressions. You can want a tempo to go up and down, you want volume to go up and down, right? So you can change the dynamics. All of these, like crescendi, diminuendi, and then maybe relations between two things and going in, going out. This will be something that we'll try to communicate using gestures. So that'll be the fun experiment for next week. And I will probably, well, I'll also post this as a comment, just kind of to, not as an announcement to explain what will be the requirements for sound gestures. Sorry, for the sound painting assignment. So basically, if you come and participate in class, you will fulfill that requirement. So I know it looks very strange, very maybe intimidating, but it's supposed to be a fun experiment of kind of interactive composing with these very abstract sound categories. And if you think about the performance act, the poiesis, if you think about the structuring as the narrative, we'll try kind of to play with both of them in our sound painting. So I devoted the whole time to one example that was in the lecture notes and in the recording in the listening room, just because uh, it's kind of the most pure and radical in some sense, or extreme example of an artist who is considered one of the major composers of of that kind of electronic music experimentalism, who actually created this piece that brings this almost in a pure form, that difficulty or that challenge of thinking about sounds and creating a musical story with very abstract musical elements. And that's kind of the one of the kind of these diamonds, basically these perfect examples of, well, here is this piece, now deal with it. Think about all the possibilities and all the questions that it brings up about composing. um, Thank you for bearing with me. I know it was difficult, or I don't know, difficult in the sense of um, following me, just being open enough to understand that a lot of the concepts that we're trying to go through are emerging, and they're always in flux in the sense of people still trying to make sense of them, but also that the intent, the creative intent, or the motivation to make and explore novel sound worlds is always there. So I hope it makes sense and inspires you. And yeah, and I will see you next week, and also in your sections. If anybody has any questions, please, well, check the chat last time. And if not, um, oh, where's the chat? It's somewhere behind. Thank you very much. All right, everybody. So see you next week.
Wait, I have two questions.
Oh yeah, please go. Can I then stop sharing? I'll stop the recording and please. Okay. Yes. Sorry about that. Yes, please.
Um, yeah, so like